Right, so here we are again looking at how to craft an essay about theme. And in this video, we're going to look at using quotes, which are the meat of the theme essay hamburger. The other things we've talked about are maybe some lettuce and some cheese and ketchup, and the introduction and conclusion will be like a bun, but the quotes in the body paragraphs are like the meat. It must be there. The burger will be pointless without the meat, unless, of course, you're a vegan, in which case this is the patty that's made out of vegetables and things. So we have to make sure that we use quotes well and that we structure our body paragraphs around these quotes that support our thesis. Remember, in a theme essay, our entire job is to use specific textual evidence to support our thesis statement, which tells the reader what one of the themes of the story is. So, how do I use quotes to support my thesis? Every time you use a quote, every time you use a quote, every time you use a quote, here are some things that you need to do. These four things are requirements. You need to introduce the quote. And I'll show you what that means. You don't just drop it in out of nowhere, all of a sudden, boom, here comes a quote. No, we need to introduce the quote so that the reader knows what we're building up to. Okay, so I'll show you how to do that. We introduce the quote, and then this one should be rather obvious. We place the quote in quotation marks. Make sure we have those because those marks tell the reader these are exact words from the text. I did not write these. The wonderful author wrote these. And then you need to include an internal citation, and sometimes you'll hear this called an in-text citation or a parenthetical citation. Parenthetical because it's inside parentheses. In text because this citation gives author information about where the quote came from, and it does it inside the paragraph. There are two places that we include author information in an essay like this. One is in text after we use a quotation, and the other is at the very end in a works cited page. And those two components work together. The internal citation is really just a marker to say, hey, if you want to know where this quote came from, look for this author in my works cited page, and it'll tell you where the quote came from. So every quote, you introduce it, you put in quotation marks, you include an internal citation, and then you explain how the quote supports your thesis. Guys, it is a bad idea to use a quote and then not explain why that helps prove your point. If you just drop a quote in there and leave it floating around, you're doing yourself a disservice because your reader may not make the same conclusion that you made. They may read that quote and say, that seems to prove the opposite of what you're trying to say. And so you need to make sure that when you use a direct quotation, that you're very clear about why that is proving your point. So let's go ahead and look at these in our wonderful theme essay example. From last time, you'll remember we have an introduction paragraph that has a hook. It has a little bit of background information so the reader is up to speed and knows what's happening. It has our thesis statement, and y'all, the thesis statement is the king of the rest of this assignment. Everything serves the thesis statement. Everything, every detail, every sentence, every body paragraph, and the conclusion, they all serve the thesis statement. They all work together to support it and prove it. So let's look at what that looks like in a body paragraph. Coming out of our introduction, here's our first body paragraph. We start out a body paragraph with a topic sentence. Right? Here's example one to support my thesis. The thesis is that in the novel Frankenstein, a theme is that time spent enjoying nature can heal the soul of many troubles. And you know what? If I finished writing my essay and I thought I could reword that better, well, I can reword that a little bit later. If I don't like how that sounds, heal the soul, I might say that it has some different abilities to heal our minds and our bodies or something like that. But for right now, that's what I'm working with. And then we would say, here's the first piece of evidence. The best evidence for the theme of nature being a healing force is the many times that Victor is rejuvenated by nature after some troubling thing happens. That's a topic sentence. It says what this paragraph is going to be about, and it supports the thesis statement. So let's go on to say what this body paragraph will include. That was the topic sentence. It just tells the reader, here's what this paragraph is about. And then we need evidence. Okay? Introducing a quote as evidence. For example, near the middle of the story, Victor has just realized just what the monster is capable of after it is responsible for the deaths of two of Victor's family members. He is broken and weary and scared, so he goes on a walk near the river Arve in his home of Switzerland. That's an introduction to a quote. If I jumped straight to the quote, the reader has no idea of the context. The reader doesn't understand why are you giving me this quote? So you need to introduce the quote, give a little bit of context. When in the story does this quote or this event take place? And then drop the quote. While there, on this walking tour of the river in this beautiful, picturesque Switzerland, while there, he says, so we get Victor's own words, these sublime and magnificent scenes afforded me the greatest consolation that I was capable of receiving. There's the quote. We're going to go on to discuss why that quote supports my thesis statement, but for right now, we introduced it, saying where it happens in the story, and then we put the quote here. It has quotation marks on each side, and then I want you to notice what happens after the quote. Remember, we need to introduce, use the quote, then we need our in-text or internal citation. And what that looks like is the author's last name and a page number in my text. So the author's last name and the page number, it goes in parentheses. And notice the period comes after the internal citation. There's no end punctuation here at the end of my sentence. I close it with a quotation mark, and then I go to my internal citation. Shelley is the last name of the author. It happens on page 86, parentheses, period. So do we see how that works? The flow of using a quote is I need to introduce it and tell my reader where this happens in the story and maybe a little bit of plot building up to it. And then I need to use the quote. I incorporated it into my sentence. While there, he says, comma. Here's the direct quote. And then I used an internal citation to say where that information came from. Where did that quote come from? Now I'm in the explanation part. We said we need to introduce a quote. We need to use the quote. We need to put an internal citation to show where the quote came from. And now almost the most important thing we can do is we need to explain it. We can't just leave it just kind of floating out there by itself. We got to explain it. And I actually use another quote to help explain this. And you'll see how I work this quote into my sentence. So, in the midst of heartache, here's another little bit of quoted text. The unstained snowy mountaintop, the glittering pinnacle, the pine woods, and ragged bare ravine cause Victor to be at peace. Notice, this text is quoted. Those are his words. This text is quoted. Those are his words. And I have used them in my sentence, just little pieces of his sentences. I've put them into my sentence to explain this quotation. So in the midst of his heartache, because the monster has killed people that he's close to, these things, these visions of beautiful natural landscape, cause him to be at peace. Notice I did another in-text citation. I didn't have to keep the last name here because we've already said this quote comes from Shelley, page 86, and I'm quoting the same author. So now I just need to put the page number. If I'm quoting from the same author that I recently did, I don't need to reattach the name to that in-text citation. I just need to put the page number. It also comes from page 86, so I put that there in parentheses, and then I put my period to close it out. And guys, just to make sure that my reader totally understands the point of this paragraph, I'm going to put a conclusion or further explanation. What is all of this saying? Boom. Nature is a healer for Victor's soul. So now what I want to do is actually read through that paragraph just so you can see the different pieces, moving from a topic sentence to the introduction of a quote, to the use of the quote, to the explanation of the quote, and how all of this moves us towards the main idea of this paragraph, which is, here's an example that shows us my thesis statement is true, that nature is a healer in this novel. So the whole paragraph. The best evidence for the theme of nature being a healing force is the many times that Victor is rejuvenated by nature after some troubling thing happens. For example, near the middle of the story, Victor has realized just what the monster is capable of after it is responsible for the deaths of two of Victor's family members. He's broken and weary and scared, so he goes on a walk near the River Arve in his home of Switzerland. While there, he says, quote, "These sublime and magnificent scenes afforded me the greatest consolation that I was capable of receiving." Shelley, 86. So, in the midst of the heartache, quote, "The unstained snowy mountaintop, the glittering pinnacle, the pine woods, and the ragged bare ravine cause Victor to, quote, be at peace." Page 86. Nature is a healer for Victor's soul. Notice how this entire body paragraph moves in one direction. Guys, there is one main idea for each body paragraph. In this paragraph, the one main idea is, here's an example that shows nature healing Victor in some way. That supports my thesis statement. It introduces a quote. It uses a quote. It cites the quote. And then in the explanation of that quote, I actually use another couple of fragments from that same page, cite them, and all of that is to say, nature is a healer for Victor's soul. Point one, proven. I have supported my thesis with this first paragraph. And notice, if I go on further, which I need to do, I need to prove it further, I'm going to transition to another detail like this. But it is not only his soul that nature heals. Earlier in the story, Victor is made physically well by spending time in nature. And this paragraph would go on, this is body paragraph 2, and it would go on to describe how after Victor is sick, feverish, in terrible health for about 2 months, he finally is able to get up and go outside, and he and his friend Henry Clerval go on these walking tours in this beautiful, beautiful place, and he feels himself getting stronger by being in nature. And I would find my quotations to support that idea, and I would introduce the quotation, which I've kind of started here. Victor is made physically well by spending time in nature. I would introduce a quote, I would use the quote, I would put a citation after the quote, and then I would explain the quote to again prove my thesis is true, that nature is a healer. Notice, everything points back to that thesis statement. And then I would have another body paragraph with some more examples, and I could have more. You'll have to have 3 body paragraphs at least, 3 different examples or explanations of why your thesis statement is true. And you could have more, but I would go on to find another detail, and then I would move on towards wrapping it up and concluding my essay. Okay, so again, using quotes. Every time we use a quote, we want to introduce the quote, we want to put it in quotation marks, we want to include our internal citation, and then explain how that quote supports the thesis. Next time, we'll talk about the conclusion paragraph. All right, guys, see you then.